Gooden. I'm the artist in residence at Concordia this year, and as part of my post, I'm lucky enough to steward this series, which is much beloved, Conversations in Contemporary Art. It's a bi-monthly lecture series, for those who aren't familiar with it, sponsored by the MFA Studio Arts program, and it's a platform that gives me great pleasure to sort of curate for a season, because it's really just about bringing in exciting minds, exciting talents, giving them a platform and having them engage with this very robust art community. So it's a true delight to have this sort of sketching pad for a term. I'm very grateful to Concordia for the opportunity. As I mentioned, it's a much beloved program, so there is a deep archive already of artists, curators, critics, and like-minded individuals. You can visit the archive at concordia.ca/CICA, C-I-C-A, to find links to a YouTube channel on which this lecture as well will live, as well as a Facebook page, etc. It's a substantial archive, and there's been a lot of talent that's rolled through these hallowed halls in recent years, so I encourage you to visit it. Also, in an effort to stay informed about upcoming talks. So this is the inaugural lecture of the term, and for one about which I'm personally very excited. It's a friend and a talent, Ben Davis, that we've brought into Montreal for this talk. But before we get to his introduction, I'd like to begin with a few important remarks and acknowledgements. First, I'd like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous land. The Ganyoge-Haiga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jojoge, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our own ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the community. Secondly, this is the Mary Ann Beckett Baxter Memorial Lecture, and we're really truly thankful for the fund and the family for their generous support. This lecture just wouldn't have been possible without that help, so many, many thanks. And then I'd like to thank the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montreal for their partnering with us on this important event, particularly somebody I'm proud to now call a friend. It's been a lot of lifting to make this happen. Francois Letourneau, who is the Associate Curator. I'll take a moment just for his remarks.
Bonsoir à tous. So, my name is Francois Letourneau. I'm an associate curator at the Musée d'Art Contemporain, in charge of public programs there as well. I'll be very short. I simply want to say what a great pleasure it is to be here tonight and welcome you to this lecture by acclaimed New York critic Ben Davis. Ben, thank you for accepting our invitation. We're very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on these modern myths of the artist's life, as seen through the lens of cinematography, a topic that I must say resonates rather well with our current presentation of Julian Roosevelt's Manifesto at the Musée, with its striking performance by Kate Blanchett. This, by the way, ends in 9 days, along with the Françoise Sullivan retrospective, if you haven't had a chance to visit. This is yet another collaboration between Concordia's Faculty of Fine Arts and the Musée d'Art Contemporain, following on Roosevelt's recent lecture at this auditorium, last year's Stern Symposium on Cohen, or other Conversations in Contemporary Art series presentations, such as Raphaël Lozano, Emma, and Christophe Bodishko in 2018, or David Jesuit in 2017. Other collaborations between our institutions include frequent participation by MAC curators to juries or studio critiques in the MFA program, joint academic and curatorial projects, and curatorial internships at the museum for Concordia students in the art history department. So I want to thank the Dean of the Faculty, Rebecca Duclos, for her ever enthusiastic support of these various initiatives. I also want to thank, of course, editor, critic, and visiting professor Sky Gooden for reaching out on this particular occasion. It's been a great pleasure working with you, and of course, everyone else at Concordia who made this event possible. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
I should also just mention before I forget that there will be a healthy Q&A afterwards. I've staged some questions with my students who have brilliant questions. Please don't be shy when it comes push to shove. These are really exciting topics that you want to elicit with them. So because it's recorded, we will be passing the mic around. Just please wait for it to come to you. So to my introduction. Ben Davis is an art critic based in New York City. He's the national art critic for ArtNet News and regularly publishes with the Brooklyn Rail, eFlux, Freeze, the New York Times, and the Village Voice, among many others. In 2013, he published a book of essays titled 9.5 Theses on Art and Class that reevaluated and redefined in accessible human terms the relationship of art to class and the agency of the artist within its system. It's a readable, at times hilarious, and crucially timed book that tonally replaces the standard self-seriousness of art criticism with something that breathes and sighs. In it, Davis ventures answers to such questions as, can political art be both good politics and good art? And is criticism still in crisis? And one of my personal favorites, what aesthetics can we attribute to the hipster? In this book and in the writing he prolifically publishes through ArtNet News and other venues, Davis casts an eye to the larger themes and landscapes in which art participates and asks relevant questions in approachable terms. He manages to do this while sacrificing none of the history, nuance, and urgency that these subjects demand. Reminding art writers everywhere, myself very much included, that even, perhaps especially, in the cacophonous climate that we're participating in right now, we should aspire to clarity. For more than a decade, Davis's writing has been met with both a wide reception and critical kudos, confirming his position in our cultural annals as a canary-like truth seeker, a man blinking through the fuselage of history and the rising torrent of opinion, and mining the fields for meaning. I'm honored to call him a friend, a peer, and I'm deeply grateful for the example he sets. May I present to you Ben Davis.
Let's see here. So, thank you all. I hate Sky's introductions because I think that canary-like truth seeker is probably too much to live up to in this lecture. But seriously, thank you to the museum and to Concordia and to Sky for having me here. So, the name of this lecture is Modern Myths of the Artist's Life, or alternatively, the Artist as Character. And it is going to be a lecture about the history of artists, a biography on film. And I consider it a fun topic. That is, you can think of it as an appetizer for your year of art or art school. But there are reasons that I'm doing it, and I'll lay them out briefly here at the beginning. The first is because it's fun, because I give lots of lectures about serious and weighty matters, and I think that it's a point that I like to make. I think there should be room for fun alongside those things and for us to come together and sort of talk about what bonds us all as our people, no matter what else, which is very likely our shared disdain of cliches about artists. Secondly, I think there are some serious points to be made, which we'll get to in the journey and at the end. But third, and maybe most important, is because we are in the middle of what I think is legitimate to claim as a worldwide boom in artist biopics. I've been slowly going through the IMDb history of movies about painters and sculptors, and as far as I can tell, the closer you get to the present, the more movies about artists there are. These are just some that have come up in just the last few years, and here are three that are just in theaters right now. One about Vincent van Gogh, one about Mark Hogenkamp, and one about Gerhard Richter. And this is actually, to me, particularly strange in the sense that, as far as I can tell, these aren't particularly, this interest in making artist films isn't particularly matched by huge hunger for artist films with the broad public. As far as I can tell, in looking into it, Julie Taymor's 2002 movie, Frida, remains the most successful artist biopic, but it did about $50 million at the box office, which is certainly respectable, but nothing like a big blockbuster, and yet these wave of movies keeps coming. So you have a kind of enigma or paradox where the idea of the importance of the artist's life is more and more woven into commercial entertainment culture, but at the same time, in a maybe not totally, its motivations don't seem to be totally commercial. And maybe that's because artists' lives are the kind of, tell the kind of story that actors and directors like to tell, which is about creative and exceptional, suffering people. And maybe it's because this kind of story is something that has something to do with the kind of conversation society is having itself about alienation and what it means to be creative and so on, that is more and more relevant. So, in the midst of all this, I asked myself, if there are more and more of these movies coming at us, what's the history of artists on film? What are the masterpieces? What are the quirks of the genre? What are the tropes you see again and again? What does it tell us about how society thinks about artists? And this is going to be a lecture with a lot of clips. Some of them are of their varying quality. Just in case you're wondering, the lecture is about 40 minutes long. The clips are all about 2 minutes long, no more than 3, just in case you're getting bored. Which I hope you will not be. But as far as I can tell, the first, at least according to the IMDb, the first example of an artist's life on film is The Affairs of Cellini, Gregory La Cava's film from 1934 about Renaissance goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini. It's sort of a bedroom farce, and it's based on a stage play. Let's take a look at it here.
You think yourself safe because the Duke has pardoned you. Well, I wouldn't be too careless with that plate, my friend. Whoever destroys Cellini before the plates are finished in turn destroys himself. He wouldn't look too handsome swinging at the end of a rope. I've provided against that emergency also. Gentlemen, it would grieve me very deeply if anything were to happen to my friend Cellini. It would further grieve me if any of these beautiful works of art were to be destroyed. Especially the model for a chalice, of which my friend is very fond. Gentlemen, I leave him to your tender mercies. Good day. The steel is sharp.
Okay, so that's The Affairs of Cellini, and what so you have some of the characteristics of the modern artist. The artist is this lusty, passionate figure. But what actually sort of interests me about this film, as the earliest example that I'm going to show you, is that it kind of predates this sort of psychological drama that we associate with the contemporary artist biopic. This scene is, it's sort of drawing on Errol Flynn, swashbuckling, and it's sort of the equivalent if in a contemporary movie about an artist, the plot stopped for like a gun battle or a car chase or something like that, which is just something you don't see. But pretty quickly, you get what you would consider to be the modern, I think the modern archetype of the sort of romantic tale of the artist. I'm thinking here of Alexander Korda's 1936 movie, Rembrandt, which is actually a pretty watchable film. I commend it to you, starring Rembrandt is it's a compelling film. And in this movie already you have the classical arc and all pretty much all the tropes that you associate with the modern tale of the artist, as exemplified by this scene, which is the unveiling of Rembrandt's famous painting, The Night Watch.
can't say. I don't understand it. I can't see anything in it.
You can't see it.
I can see nothing but shadows, darkness, and confusion. You surely don't expect us to take this as serious art?
Something's got to be done. They're furious. They're making fun of it, laughing. Can't you hear them? It's no good standing there twiddling your moustache.
They say they won't pay. They say you must make the fresh picture. But the American thinks you are doing is real beyond a joke. I agree with you, it is.
Go on, say something to them.
You're not suggesting that I should apologize.
I'm asking you to save the situation, that's all. Think of what's at stake.
Save the situation. All right.
So there, they just don't understand the Night Watch. They don't get poor Rembrandt. And that's what I call you call this art scene, which is very familiar trope of these movies. And of course, the gag, right, is that we as an audience, we know that this is like one of the most famous artworks in history. So we identify in our own alienations, in our own work, with the artist who is misunderstood and done down. It's that sort of you don't call that art scene. It's sort of the pair of the other classic trope of these movies, which I'm going to show you the example of the final scene. So spoiler alert from John Huston's 1952 movie about Toulouse-Lautrec, Moulin Rouge, starring Jose Ferrer as the artist, and with a cameo by Zsa Gabor as one of the dancers at Moulin Rouge. So this is the last scene of the film, the deathbed scene.
Can you hear me, Harvey? Listen. This is from Maurice Royan. Listen. The Louvre has accepted Camon the collection. This makes you only artist to be so honored in his lifetime. Do you hear me, Harvey? Your paintings are to hang in the Louvre. I didn't understand. Forgive me, Harvey. I didn't understand.
There's the most beautiful creature waiting for me at Maxim's. Goodbye, Henri. Goodbye.
There you have it. That is really the classic, a classic. It's almost like too perfect, too illustrative artist deathbed scene where on is that his father comes to him and says, "I never understood, but you're redeemed because you're going to be in the Louvre," and then he dies tragically. But the subjects of his art, the marginalized people that Toulouse-Lautrec captured in his great paintings, live on forever through him, and he joins them in artistic heaven or wherever he goes as a secular saint. Which brings us to probably the most iconic art movie of all time, which is 1956's Vicente Minnelli film Lust for Life. This is the only example in this talk where I'm going to show you a trailer instead of a clip. I could give an entire talk about artist trailers. Old movie trailers are amazing. But in this case, I think it packs in quite a lot. And so that's where we're gonna start.
Few people know the real story of this intense, strong-willed man. Now his tumultuous career is revealed for the first time with frankness and intimacy, with all that lust for life which drove him to the extremes of passion.
Are you such a weakling that you can't stand the little pain of a disappointment in love? Must you whimper about it?
What do you know about pain? I've seen agonies that you've never dreamed of. I'll show you whether I can stand pain. Let me talk to Kay for as long as I can keep my hand in this flame.
Vincent!
Even less conventional is Vincent's lusty, brawling friend, Paul Gauguin, vividly enacted by Anthony Quinn.
What's all this talk about Elysian women? I haven't seen a good one yet.
They must have heard you were coming and they locked them up.
Yeah.
Now, wait till you see, Paul. There's something about them. The way they carry themselves, even the old ones, a certain classic grace and dignity.
Dignity? I'm talking about women, not women. I like them fat and vicious and not too smart. Nothing spiritual either. To have to say I love you would break my teeth.
An hour before dawn, in the Bohemian Paris of the Moulin Rouge, the beginning of a stormy friendship, which ended in violence.
Why don't you shut up? If you have to slobber, don't do it over me. When have you done a stroke of manual labor in your life? Well, I have. I've done ditches in the stinking heat of the tropics. I worked in the docks in weather so cold my hands froze to the ropes. And I can tell you there's nothing noble or beautiful about it. I did it so I could go on painting. I didn't have a brother to support me.
Oh, great, motion picture. So, there are 3 points I want to make about that. Okay, first is, isn't it amazing that it all begins as like, few people know the truth of this extraordinary person, and then it goes on to present what is transparently the most romanticized, over-the-top, untruthful version of this. But that trope is very important. I think it's very important to the artist biopic as a genre that is rooted in truth, because artists, as I say, serve sort of as the image of a secular saint whose suffering redeems us. The second point is, and incidentally, on the truthfulness of it, Anthony Quinn, in his biography, claimed that the ghost of Paul Gauguin visited him during his rehearsals, and it was because of the resulting truthfulness that he was able to win an Oscar for it. The second thing is that what I think is significant about this movie is it really sets the type for the artist legend. These are really the two things: the suffering artist, the Van Gogh character, and the lusty artist whose passion overspills the bounds of society, the Gauguin character, really are the two archetypes of the artists that go forward and intermingle in all kinds of different ways. And the third thing, and it's important not to go around about, is is just, it's actually a pretty charming movie. I commend it to you, you should see it. There's a clip I would show you if I had time where they have this very long and passionate debate about the merits of the painter Millet that I think is hilarious and charming. But that's not how they sell the movie, right? What they sell it is like Van Gogh as a tortured artist who can't take no for an answer from a woman, and Gauguin holding court at the night cafe with a misogynist rant about women. That is baked into the artist myth. This kind of some very unsavory stuff. And there's no better way to illustrate that, in my opinion, than taking a brief look at the 1986 Henning Carlsen film Oviri, or The Wolf at the Door, starring Donald Sutherland as Gauguin. This clip comes from a part of the movie where the 14-year-old Swedish girl, who's the daughter of the couple that Gauguin is living with in Paris, comes to see him in his studio, and he explains to her why he left his life and his wife behind in Tahiti.
Why did you leave her?
Can't imagine. And there, behind the piano, bring me the third of those paintings. There she is. Her name is Dea Amara.
You said she was happy. Why she looks so sad?
Oh. It is because they know how to be genuinely happy that they can also allow themselves to be genuinely sad. In any case, one of the many things they understand is that somewhere, lying in wait, is the most terrible thing that will ever happen to you.
How old was she? Your wife in Tahiti, how old was she?
13.
Younger than me.
Oh, it's just so, this is a movie, Donald Sutherland is very good as Gauguin, I think, in this movie, but this is a movie that is spectacularly problematic. It's sort of a critical cliche about how the myth of the great white male genius is this problematic thing that excuses a lot of horrible stuff. If you want proof of how it does that, watch this movie. It's all focalized around this 14-year-old girl and her sexual awakening as he has sex with his various models and lovers in the next room, and it ends in what I think is supposed to be a heartwarming scene as she tries to seduce him to get back to Tahiti, have him take her as her child bride back to Tahiti, and when he says no, she gives him a bow made of her pubic hair so that he will remember her fondly. And the movie, I think, wants you to think that's a charming or a good thing. It's so out there that I thought maybe that's the point. That it's sort of intentionally showing you the darker side of the artist. But no, I looked up the reviews, and almost all of them are simply refer to Sutherland's character as this unconventional, free-living rogue, and so on. Incidentally, as a fun fact, Donald Sutherland's son, Kiefer Sutherland, also played Gauguin in a movie that is so bad that it's not even worth showing the clip of. Definitely, sexuality is very important to the movies, almost universally. It's almost as if the language that society uses to understand creative passion is actual sexual passion. That the available language to understand being absorbed in something is through love and sex. And of course, the figure that bears a lot of that load in these kind of stories is the muse. And now, so one thing that's very notable in all of these modern films about artists is that the muse is always a figure that I call the diabolical muse. And I'm going to illustrate that with this clip from the pretty bad 2006 Raul Ruiz film about Klimt, featuring a totally catatonic John Malkovich as the Austrian artist.
You?
Yes, it's me. They told me you were one of those men who like their women naked. It isn't always the case, you know. Here in France, nudité is no longer comme il faut. Whiskey? At the moment, whiskey's all the rage in Paris. But then, as you know, the rage changes so quickly in this city. 6 months ago, it was port with a splash of bitters. And last year, it was strawberries and champagne. But that's enough gossip. Shall we get down to business? You said publicly that you'd be delighted to paint my portrait. I can scarcely believe it.
Believe it, mademoiselle. Believe it.
What do you think? The Duke Wolf Helena adores it.
Who?
A friend. A very dear friend. Let's say an intimate friend.
And is he in Paris just at the moment?
Who knows? The Duke is a globetrotter.
Don't you trot the globe with him?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I don't. Au fond, he's an artist. An artist who just happens not to possess any talent. So instead of painting me himself, he commissions other talented artists to do it for him.
Is he?
You haven't told me yet what you think of this whistler.
If it were amusing, it would be laughable.
You have a cruel streak. I like the cruelty of artists. Tends to leave a bittersweet aftertaste.
So, an incredibly clunky scene. I mean, it's useful as sort of showing this this trope in its pure form. There's a diabolical muse trope. I mean, she might as well just have a big sign above her head flashing danger. But it is possible to, let me show you a much more interesting version of the diabolical muse trope from Derek Jarman's really, really good film, Caravaggio. This is a queer take on Caravaggio. It's a very interesting experimental, kind of considered a classic of postmodern film. And here you can see a pretty good artist working with some of the same, doing some, well, out there things with the same trope. Young Sean Bean as the Caravaggio's muse.
You're in love with him. With his money. You're in love with him.
It's a really tough version of that trope. So I think what's happening here, in terms of the muse, this figure really is there on in that figure is working out the essential thesis about creativity that most of these movies pose in this sort of double-sided character of inspiration and destruction. Is that creativity is both this thing that inspires you and opens up new worlds and takes you to places of intensity that you don't know. It fulfills you, because all these stories are ultimately about the subtext of all of these movies, ultimately the alienation that people normally feel in the work of art. So the muse inspires, but it also destroys you, takes away everything it gives, and so the movies kind of give you a glimpse of what you could have, but then also it's serve the double purpose of being stories about why you couldn't or shouldn't want them in the same way. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, that this is obviously a gendered construct, and as there have been more and more movies made about female artists, it's sort of interesting to note that I don't think that there's usually an equivalent figure to the diabolical muse figure in these movies. Instead, there's another kind of character that I call the tormenting mentor. And the most interesting thing about Tim Burton's 2014 Big Eye, which is about sort of kitsch artist Margaret Keane, is that it specifically focuses around its narrative around this kind of story.
I think it's creepy, modeling and amateurish.
Exactly. I love it.
We got in early. Feeling free. Oh. Thanks.
Hey, baby. Killer party. It's happening. So where's your stuff?
Oh, we decided that this would just be Walter's show.
Oh, we did? Why would we do that?
Oh, because Walter is more established.
Strange, Walter doesn't really strike me as a cute, hungry kitten type.
It's really good to see you. And thank you for coming.
Your husband's quite a talent. Do you paint too?
I don't know.
I'm curious about your technique. How long did that piece take to execute? That? Probably months. First the thinking, the sketching, then the time with just me and the oils. Oils? But isn't that acrylic? That, yeah. Yeah, it's like a jumble of ideas and rattling around in my brain. So where do you get your ideas?
What do you mean?
So, in case you haven't seen the movie or don't know, they're her paintings, of course, and he's the guy who has both enabled the commercial success by because people are more receptive to a male artist, and he has the power, but also the entire movie is her moving beyond that. Now, has anybody in this room seen Fur, an imaginary portrait of Diane Arbus? So this is one of the few movies that I think that actually kind of breaks the mold on this score. There actually is something in it like the diabolical muse character in a movie focalized around a woman. It stars Nicole Kidman as the photographer Diane Arbus, and Robert Downey Jr. as Lionel, her muse, who it does have a tormenting mentor figure. She has her photographer husband, and she's kind of the assistant, and nobody sees that she's an artist as well. But then she discovers that her neighbor is this man who's completely covered in hair, and she discovers herself through a relationship with him. Let's watch a little bit of that. This is the key, of the beginning of the key scene.
Close the door.
And what can you say about it? I mean, this is clearly the equivalent of the Malkovich scene where the kind of muse awakens something in the artist. Her act of shaving Lionel is clearly supposed to be her taking command of some sort of creative agency. It's mirrored in, Arbus's particular kind of relationship to photography, outsiders, and so on. But it just doesn't work. It's so it's as if I would say that the film is still working towards a kind of language that works with this kind of relationship, because Nicole Kidman's performance is just so evacuated and blank, and it is extremely important, because it is extremely important to the myth of the artist, that the artist, as I said, sensuality is the language through which creativity is experienced in these movies, and no better way to represent that, once more, than this film, BBC film about the life of Hogarth. Here's the key scene.
Does he treat you well? Mr. Hirsch?
You mean, is he gentle in the act? Not particularly. But at least he tends to be quick. If I do my work well, he reaches full satisfaction externally. Forgive me, sir, if I upset you. It's just we whores, we tend to say things that make respectable gentlemen blush. Can't help it.
But an artist, a real artist, isn't easily embarrassed. You see, to paint something, to find what it really is, paint that. To look inside yourself, you must stare at them, and stare at them. Stare right through the clothes on their back, through their bodices, petticoats, through their skin and bones, to their very soul. Who they really are.
Heavens.
Heavens. So that's what I call the he's so real scene, or the she's so real scene. Again, a very common trope is this moment where the artist stuns onlookers with their rawness or their power. And it has to be said that usually this is not done often, or sometimes, I'd say 25% of the time, it's done in the form of a speech like that. It's a pretty wooden way to do it. But often it's very important that this is done not through language, it's incarnated, which is, I think, what is shown partly by probably the most famous scene from Julie Taymor's 2002 Frida, which I already mentioned, which I'll show you just the beginning of the scene. This is Antonio Banderas as David Alfaro Siqueiros, the muralist, Alfred Molina as Diego Rivera, Ashley Judd as Tina Medodi, the photographer, and Hayek as Kahlo. And here they are at a party arguing about politics.
I prefer evolution. Educate the poor. Mobilize the workers. Rise like a small tide. You'll have your revolution and kill half the poor to save them. Yeah, no. This from the communists who's getting rich, painting for the government, or wealthy patron. I can't help it if the rich have good taste.
The rich don't have good taste. They pay someone to have good taste for them. And they don't hire you because you're good. They hire you because you assuage their sense of guilt. They use you, Diego. And you are too vain to see it.
No!
Basta. Whoever takes the biggest swig can dance with me.
and I lamentably do not have time to show you the entire Paso Doble scene from Frida. But the thing about this scene is what I like about that exchange. Aside from, this is again the she's so real in this case. People are stunned and awakened by her, by the life of Frida Kahlo. But what this shows is more or less, drinking contest is more or less the order of priority that the artist puts on the various traits associated with the artist in the movie. So coming in third place is Siqueiros, and the movie has really almost no interest, representing politics, I should say, and really has really no interest in the radical politics of the artists involved. Certainly not the Trotskyism of Diego, the Stalinism of Siqueiros, let alone the Stalinism of Tina Modotti, who is not just a angelic muse as she is here, but was in fact a Stalinist agent who was involved in assassination attempts. And then coming in second place is Diego, who here represents taste and the successful technique, the success of the artist on those levels. But then the one who drinks deepest from the cup of art is Frida Kahlo, with her pure sensual carnal passion. And that is really the order of priority that the movie accords to the values of art. Now, 1996's Julian Schnabel Basquiat is actually a pretty good film, with a great performance by Jeffrey Wright. And I'm going to show you what is, I believe, it's the pair of the "they just don't get it" scene that I showed you in Rembrandt, which is the "it's great" scene. And this is the most famous scene in the film. When Basquiat comes in, a young Basquiat comes in to confront Andy Warhol, played by David Bowie, and the gallerist Bruno Bischoffer, played by Dennis Hopper, with a really indistinct German accent, and while they're having a business lunch.
Can I help you? You want less ignorant art? $10 a piece. No, I think it's okay. Cost me sufficient.
Gee, ignorant art? No.
Yeah, like stupid, like ridiculous, crummy art.
Oh, that sounds good. It's new.
$10.
Oh, gee, it didn't work very much in these. I'll give you like 5. Bruno, you're rich. You should talk to Bruno.
You don't even work on your stuff.
No, it's not how much you work on something that matters, it's how much you get for it.
And you get 10.
Those are great, Bruno. Yeah, take 2. Take, what's these? Take this one. I don't know. Bruno, can I borrow some money?
Yeah.
Here, you'll have change.
I mean, good deal. You gave us 2.
Oh, let me look at those.
Yeah, but they're mine now. Huh?
Sure they're yours, Bruno. Everything good's yours.
Okay. So that's a fairly nuanced version of what I call, as I say, that it's really good scene. Because these movies are full of scenes, and maybe it's just because I'm an art critic and my job is trying to figure out whether things are good or bad, but it was really notable in like almost every art movie, from the beginning of time to today. The mode of aesthetic a perception is you step in front of something and you say, it's great. Opinion, judgment always arrives fully formed. There's never processes of thinking about, digesting ideas, comparing. And what's actually, aside from the charmingness of the performances, what's kind of interesting about the narrative construction is, Basquiat is deliberately playing on that, right? Like, do you want some ignorant art? He's like offering it as something that's unreflective. He's offering his art up. He's playing with that mythology. And the interesting thing about 2000's Pollock, directed and starring Ed Harris, and with Marsha Gay Harden as Jackson Pollock, Marsha Gay Harden as Lee Krasner, is specifically how it hones in on this, the directness of artistic experience as its central drama in this film. So, well, best way to explain this is just to watch the clip.
What's this? I see the head, the body. This isn't cubism, Jackson, because you're not really breaking down the figure into multiple views. You're just showing us one side. And what is this? Free association? Automatism?
I'm just painting, Lee.
But what you're doing, Jackson, don't tell me you don't know what you're doing. Are you experimenting with surrealism? Is this a dream? Even if it's a dream, it's still what you see. It's life. You're not just randomly putting paint on the canvas. You're painting something. You can't abstract from nothing. You can only abstract from life, from nature.
From nature.
If you only work inside yourself, you'll repeat yourself.
She paint the fuck with that.
I'm glad the audience finds that as funny as I do, and that Lee Krasner was trying to explain, is explaining what's surrealism and automatism, or the Jackson Pollock is painting. To its credit, the movie is actually kind of has a feminist subtext, or actually is the text of the movie about how Jackson Pollock is really unpleasant and inarticulate, and Lee Krasner, he would be nothing without Lee Krasner being his ambassador and sacrificing for him. It is a rare artistic movie, artistic biopic, where you really do come out of this film liking Jackson Pollock a lot less. Like, he's just an unpleasant person who doesn't seem to be in control or command of what he's doing. And this is an interesting historical test case. Jackson Pollock, the art critic Lawrence Alloway, talks about how the idea of the artist statement, the artist interview, were products of the abstract expressionist period, where you had art that was seemingly freed completely from narrative, and that coincided in the textual world of textuality around art with a rise of artist statements that sort of control or reclaim these things. And that is sort of what this movie ends up being about, is the tragedy of Jackson Pollock's direct relationship to his art, that he's never able to integrate with a kind of a narrative that he feels comfortable telling, which means it makes a tragic version out of this kind of direct, pre-semiotic relationship to the art, which is the foundation, on the other hand, of the heroic myth of the artist, best represented by the most famous scene from 1965's Carol Reed film, The Agony and the Ecstasy, starring Charlton Heston as Michelangelo. This is a scene that this is a movie so self-important that it begins with a 12-minute long biography about documentary about Michelangelo's work, and has an intermission despite the fact that it's less than 2 hours long. This is the scene that comes from the midpoint of the film, when Michelangelo has decided that he's a sculptor, not a painter, so he can't make the Sistine Chapel, and he leaves behind the commission because he doesn't know how to finish it, and he's hiding out from the Pope's troops in Carrara. When they show up, the workers tell him, "Flee to the mountains, Michelangelo," and he sleeps in a cave above the clouds and comes out.
male and female. God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly moving creatures that have life. And fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven.
Oh, that's great. That's it. That's really the nut of the myth of the artist, right? Is that art doesn't come from, it is the product of this direct relationship, that sort of divine inspiration, and so we're towards the end of this. Stay with me. We're almost at the end. One more reel clip, 1.5. Question now is, 50 minutes in, why do we care? These are sort of middle brow kind of films for the most part, that most people, part of the reason I'm showing to you is because they're kind of funny. But I do think it's worth mentioning, and this is one of the reasons I ended with Michelangelo, is that stories about artists are very important, right? That most people in the Western tradition, in the European tradition of art, trace the beginning of art history to Giorgio Vasari's The Lives of the Artists, which really define the way we think about artists and define the canon of the Renaissance. A lot of these are invented stories, and to a certain extent, the Irving Stone version of Michelangelo from The Agony of Ecstasy that we see there is a descendant of the kind of divinely inspired Michelangelo that Vasari invented, as in the origin of the whole reason why we value art the way we do is because it's associated in a certain kind of way with a certain kind of biography and lives of the art, and that's a very important point to make. This is the one kind of big concept I'm going to drop into this lecture, the concept of fetishistic disavowal, which I think describes our relationship with these stories of art, which is the concept of fetishistic disavowal are ideological structures where you say to yourself, I know very well that it's untrue, and yet I'm going to behave as if it's true. And the most famous example of that is money, right? It circulates. We all know money is just paper. You can't eat money. But the entire society is structured around this fiction, that the fiction has actual effect. And I think that is more or less true of our relationships to artists, these kind of like Goonie stories about artists in the good and bad ways, as in in sort of similar way to the way our relationship in art world to wall labels, that we all like to tell ourselves that we're having an ideal position is to have a direct relationship with the work of art, and yet we all read the wall labels. And I think that we all know that artists aren't tragic individual visionaries, and yet when it comes right down to it, that's one of the ways that's how they circulate in society. That's how the tropes that people read them through. Those are very important. This is, I'll just play it. This is my own contribution to the artist film genre. It's giving away the end there. This is just the advertising for the Museum of Modern Art's Baccabbia show a few years ago, which I think is striking to me because Baccabbia is an artist who had like a relationship with fascism, right? And at that moment in 2016, it seemed to be important to be having a conversation about artists and their relationship with fashion and what that looks like. And yet, if you caught it, the entire framework for how the museum advertised this show is all these same artistic cliches that we've been talking about all night. I am a creative monster, live your passion, and so on. So these are, even though these are sort of like silly myths, they still structure the reception and they sort of form the temperature of the waters that we swim in. And which brings me to the probably one of the most important artistic movies in recent years, Thomas Kincaid's Christmas Cottage, about the great American painter of light, Thomas Kincaid. This is a film about the early young life of Thomas Kincaid, played by Jared Padalecki. And in this scene, he talks to his mentor, the fictional Glenn Woodruff, who's a painter as well, who gives him his philosophy of art.
How's your work? I'd like to see what you've been painting.
Still lost, really.
Here. I've been doing a lot of expressionistic stuff lately. That will get you lost very quickly. Don't reduce art to something that's about the artist. Art isn't about the artist, it's about life. Beauty. Love. Emotion. Art should bring emotion that can topple tyranny. I haven't forgotten.
So, a hilariously clunky piece of dialogue that is hidden under the tremendous conviction that Peter O'Toole brings to it. This is sort of the romantic cliche of yours writ large, it would seem. But I contend, in conclusion, that there is something sort of unintentionally profound about Glenn Woodruff's speech in that film. So he says, don't reduce art to something that is about the artist, which is like, it seems to be like an anti-biographical statement, you know, it's for this kind of direct relationship with the art that we're talking about. And then he continues to say, art isn't about the artist, it's about life. That is the fetishistic disavowal perfectly encapsulated, that it's like, these things are silly and yet they structure how to a certain degree things function. And I think it's tempting to dismiss all these things as cliches and be like, we're going to have this direct relationship with these things. And I think that is the wrong approach. That the categories by which you comprehend art are part of the art itself. The stories that circulate around it are part of the story itself. It's part of what motivates people and engages people around these things. And I think perhaps the small lesson you can take away from the history of this kind of movie, these kind of films, is that new forms of art are going to require new kinds of stories, new forms of storytelling about art. And that is a small fortune in this cookie, is something that is the beginnings of a thought to take away into your own creative lives from this. Thank you. Spoken for a long time, but I'm here to take questions about this or anything else.
Yeah, let's take, I don't know, 15 minutes or less. It depends on, how many questions we have. I certainly have a couple lined up myself, but I'd be really thrilled to kind of throw this to the room for a few minutes. Any questions from the audience? While people are sort of finding their words, I want to ask if you've seen The Square. And also if who in the room has seen The Square. Okay, quite a few. I wondered if that was something that you thought about including, just because when it comes to sort of the division between like the mythos and truth, I feel like The Square is one of those rare breeds where it gets a little bit closer to, not the truth of an artist's life perhaps, but the art world, the politics, what happens institutionally, the kinds of agendas that prevail.
No, I lamentably have not seen The Square. I sort of actually started out to do a history of artists on film as fictional characters, and then decided, for the reasons of thinking about Vasari really, that I decided to do a history of artist biopics. I mean, yeah, I agree with you. the parts I've seen of the square, and the funny thing about the square is how not funny it is. You know, there's the famous scene, particularly since I work for an art news website, the scene where they're workshopping, they're talking to these PR consultants, and they're like, well, here's the premise of the artwork, you know, it's like whoever stands here is in the square, and the PR consultants are like, well, that's not a story, you know, that's what's happening in the artwork. That's funny because it's not really a joke, you know, that's just really how the news works.
Yeah, we have a question over here.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I guess thinking about movies about artists makes me think about the context that they provide. You know, what was the time and place where these artworks were made? I mean, it seems like these movies aren't really invested or interested in that. It's more about their life, but then it makes me think about art criticism. And when you're writing about artwork or an artist, how important is their life?
Yeah, really important. And I mean, I guess a very specific artists, museums are specifically stuck in this mode, you know? They're you know, not just the Macabre, like almost anything. It's almost like, I really do think, you know, there's this kind of postmodern mode of thinking where we're beyond all this, and we're really not. I mean, museums do not know, at this point, how to tell stories about artists that aren't heroic. And particularly now, you know, post-Me Too, you know, there's a lot of rethinking about the canon, and I do not think museums are intellectually equipped to deal with artists who are complex, you know, who are bad people. You know, the only story that people know how to tell about artists is the Michelangelo, divine inspiration, artist as hero, artist as suffering visionary. It's actually a pretty limited palette. I think sort of ended with the idea that you need to be able to learn how to tell new stories. That's sort of how I think about my criticism, in a way, is that I try and dig into the real history and tell the real stories of these things. But the detail I think the fake stuff, the Goonie stuff, the romantic myths of art are part of the context. I guess that's the point I'm making. And I didn't mention this during the talk, but I should have, is that the way I think about it, I used to do a lot of criminal justice activism. And one of the things that's very important in that is something called the CSI effect, right? Which is that juries, when they're deciding a case, often have this idea, because of what they've seen on TV, that forensic evidence is much more accurate than it actually is. And that it actually has a material effect on how juries decide cases, because they tend to believe the police more than they should. And if that's true of something as serious and grave as that, it's also that these kind of mythological narratives in a space that's as prone to being manipulated by fantasy and fictions and runs mainly on passion is all the more so.
I guess my question is more towards identity politics, where you have to communicate someone's identity in art criticism. So how do you do that without fetishizing the artist or the artwork, where you want to communicate who this person is and how that informs the art, but without crossing that line that I think these films do?
I'm afraid I don't think there's a linear answer to that question, actually. And this is a very stock, like, Marxist inflected way of answer to that, but it's like dialectical, right? Like, there's not actually, because power works in both ways. It works by suppressing the biography, and it works by reducing people to biography. So it's really, I think what you want to do is avoid a formula, look at where the discourse stands, and you're kind of like tacking back and forth around these things, because the history of the reception of artists is really, you know, this ping-ponging overcorrection, and the answer is really this contradictory thing in the middle, where, you know, art is this independent thing that circulates independently of the artist, but also art is also completely bound up and tied up in context and experience and so on. Is that helpful?
I'm wondering, in preparation for this talk, I had our students read one of the segments from your four-part State of the Art. Was that the title, or State of Art and Culture, that you put out about a year ago? And there's a segment there where you're really focusing on sort of what's happening in terms of mythos on Instagram through artists' lives, how the kind of promotion and branding of contemporary art, or the marrying of that kind of populism is happening through contemporary art on that platform in a really sort of singular way. And I wonder if we can just think a bit about, like, the promulgation of these myths is, I guess, accredited to hacky writers and directors. I mean, that's kind of been the thread of the talk, but what are you seeing, if anything, in terms of the change of the myth when it comes into the artist's own hands?
Well, I don't know if I'm equipped to really generalize yet about that. I think we're in a new moment. I mean, and to a certain extent, to the extent that I'm correct, that I do think if you look at the curve of production of artist movies over time, it is, it's increasing linearly. You know, there are more all the time, and I do think that has something to do with the fact that. The further we go, the more capitalism democratizes the means of creative production, the more everyday, ordinary people are sort of empowered to think of themselves as artists on a very low level kind of way. And also just easier it is to make movies that look like professional movies. And so I do think that there is an interesting thing going on. I wouldn't want to take this thought too much, but where the artist, or the suffering of the artist, which tends to be this representation about what it looks like if you don't have a normal job. You know, what it looks like if you do work that also you love. You know, that you're passionately invested in somehow. There are no artist biopics, as far as I can tell, about like a Velasquez. You know, who is a court painter and is good at what he does, and it just, that's not the story people want to tell. The story of the artist tends to be about the outside of work, what it looks like. There's a cautionary tale about the world beyond alienation. I wouldn't want to take this too far, but like there's a process where the population, because of economic conditions, has become more, like our conditions of work have changed a lot. So that like people have this entrepreneurial idea of producing your own life and self-branding fostered on them. And so the character of the artist becomes all tangled up with that kind of story. But yeah, in terms, I don't know, this is I've sort of extracted myself deliberately from Instagram and stuff in the last year. And I think that it's an interesting platform for people to build new kinds of things. Those kind of things, it's a place where people are experimenting with new ways to forge their own narrative and talk to people. I don't think it in any way frees people from the ambient pop culture cliches. In some ways, I think it strengthens them. To the extent that it ties people to their own self, you know, the artist as the product of literally your direct experience.
One more time, we got 7 more. Any other questions? Something I was thinking about and don't quite know how to articulate in a question form, but I guess I'm wondering, you were talking about how CSI, the CSI effect, how that has like real life implications in your experience of like the criminal justice process. And so when we're talking about these biopics of artists and artist myths, I'm wondering if you could talk about how you think that affects how we think of artists in a real world context, and especially since so many of these movies only depict a certain variety of artists, and there are so many more other people making art out there?
I mean, it's a great question. That's the kind of question, it's the question I end the talk on. I mean, I think that, what I would say is that's an artistic question. I mean, the philosopher Nelson Goodman said something like, the categories you bring to the artwork, they look at it through, are part of the artwork. And I think that I've taught artists, I've taught artists writing. In my experience, artists hate, But it's part of the way you control your narrative, it's the part of the way people are gonna approach your work. The romantic myth of the artist, yeah, I think it's mainly bad. It obfuscates a lot of things. One of the ways you see it really activated is like, when do artists achieve a sort of a popular penetration? I mean, if you think of the last 10 years, for instance, it's always when they kill themselves or when they are jailed. It's Ai Weiwei, it's Mike Kelly, And at that point, suddenly, society notices, and this taps into this deep and primal kind of thing that society wants from artists, which is them to be dead, or them to be suffering. And that is, it's a negative thing. It's how the discourse works. I don't know exactly how to answer your question yet, because I think that that's sort of what we're locked in, and it's sort of through this talk that the problem surfaces for me. But I do think that, and this is partly manifest through the kinds of stories that you tell about yourself through your own artist statements and the kind of social universe that you create for yourself, that creating, building new kinds of stories is part of the process of, it's part of the medium of art. I think you have to take that really seriously, actually. I wish I knew. There's probably different answers for every different kind of artist. I think it's an interesting challenge, though.
Thank you for a great talk, Ben. It was interesting to see how these myths and mythological figures or mythopoieses of artists play out. The question I have for you is, one thing I was thinking about during your presentation was, all of the artists that you were showing as evidencing these myths of the hero or the tortured genius, or the muse, or the evil mentor was, number one, they all work in painting. There's a very narrow medium in which they work in. They're all historical artists. There are no films that are made about contemporary art. That is not a documentary like Banksy's through the gift shop. The one thing I would like to ask you is, I was thinking of the flip side of these representations of artists, and the flip side is not one that is heroic or mythological. It's where the artist, representations of contemporary artists in films, and I'm thinking sort of Ileana Douglas in Art School Confidential as the kind of flaky video artist, teacher, is that when artists who deal in contemporary practices or non-traditional practices are represented either in film or in television, they become a joke as opposed to they become a figure of ridicule rather than one of sympathy or heroicism, or they don't play into those mythologies. How would you address that, the figure of the artist, as a joke, as a figure of humor or pretension, within the scope of what you presented tonight?
Okay, so for part one is, it's true, they're all painters like Michelangelo, except he becomes a pedo. But look, I think the myth is very heavily bound up in artisanal practices, and the most experimental it gets is Jackson Pollock, and I don't know that they totally land that. I think, yeah, because my assessment is my own theoretical assessment is that what the society wants out of artists is this kind of ideal kind of work relationship where you're invested in your personal expression is invested directly in the kind of work you're doing. Artisanal forms of labor just most obviously fit that, I think, mythologically. And so I think that's what's going on there. I think it's an interesting challenge to bring to bear, and I think probably people will take up that challenge. It is true that I did a chart that I didn't manage to lay in time for the talk, where if you track the distance between the death of the artist and the date the movie was made, the closer you get to the present, the more that compresses. So there is some kind of project. We're becoming more and more of contemporary in terms of just the way we think about art in general, and the speed at which like things get mythologized and heroicized is compressing. But it's, yeah, I think it does. There is some pushback there, and then I think that's a great point. The last one, and it's interesting, right? That I mean, I think about it in terms of the Big Lebowski, and people remember Julianne Moore's character. This is kind of like really, you know, if you extract from how funny the movie is, kind of mean-bearded caricature of the feminist artist in the film. And I think that the interesting thing about the figure of the fictional artist in contemporary cinema is that that figure in the movies that I just showed you is always played by the art critic. You know, the art critic is always the figure of fun for being over-intellectual, kind of a fancy pants, and out of touch with the actual, you know, tissue and reality of life, being, you know, too fancy, having their head up their butt. And that is more or less, I think, that is what artists, how artists tend to be represented in contemporary film. I don't know what to do with that insight about that pair, but it's a good place to start for another chapter of the story. One more.
Any other questions? Yeah, got a couple.
I wanted to go back to the question of identity politics because there was something in one of your essays that we read that caught my attention, where you were summarizing another scholar's analysis of kind of increasingly openly commercial pop art in that spectrum. And you mentioned identity politics as being sort of the domain of major academic museum type work. And but I had this articulated more clearly in my notes. And I'm just wondering if you can speak more to the role that's been played by identity politics as an impetus that's put forth on social media and as a populist movement. So if you think of social justice language or calls for greater representation of marginalized communities in collections and exhibitions, versus this kind of idea of like political correctness, I think is what you called it, as something that's the concern of just rarefied institutions.
So what do you say you're talking about?
I can read you the quote. So this is from Commerce and Consciousness. Johanna Drucker's book, Sweet Dreams, Contemporary Art and Complicity, you summarize the notion of oppositional critique, the idea that criticism should challenge the reigning values of its time, has been reduced to justifying artwork based on political correctness.
Yeah, well, I was saying there that she is saying that, though. But your question is about the role of the moment that we're in, about the identity of the artist seems to be very important right now in terms of representation. What's the question about it? It's just...
So, well, just because you mentioned political correctness, which I think is sort of a contentious way to describe the inclusion of marginalized communities or identity-concerned works in a really public sphere. And then I was just wondering if you could kind of unpack the idea.
Oh yeah, but I don't think I'm saying that, I wasn't using political correctness as a pejorative. I'm saying that she's framing it that way. That is really the story of the moment, right? Is like that. I think that's it's fair to say that that is how our contemporary moment will be remembered. Is this kind of revaluation of the canon, the attempt to discover new kinds of stories about artists. Social media has provided a tremendous platform for that, and might even probably has contributed to the concern with it. I think that there's a looming it was alluded to before about this question between like reducing the artist to their biography and then divorcing the artist to their biography. And I think that as compared to even 5 years ago, the pendulum has swung really hard towards, what's valuable about art is the biography of the artist. And for pretty good reasons, because this is, I think it's a historic moment. We'll remember this moment as a moment when a lot of new kinds of stories entered the museum, new kinds of voices. I will say that, the history of this is loaded with pendulum swings, where the conversation becomes dominated by the biography of the artist, and then that becomes really limiting towards artists, and I always think it's the African American artist Romare Bearden. He said once, the problem with these white art critics is you can't get a straight answer from them about whether you're a good artist or not. They're just treating you as a black artist. I think we're maybe a little bit on that side of things. I think that there's a sense in which the conversation that we're having now is so urgent that some of the messier issues about how you distinguish between different kinds of work are being left in the dust. But that's a conversation that I think is looming, and good critics are taking it up. And I'm optimistic about it.
Well, I guess to follow that thought, do you feel like there is a way to a level playing field in terms of evaluating quality?
Way to a level in terms of evaluating quality. Well, what do you mean in terms of?
Like when you say that this person was concerned with never being able to get a straight answer if critics thought that his work was good or not.
Right. Well, I mean, these questions are fraught because society is really unequal, right? And so there are lots of. I mean, is there? I don't think there's probably a way to look at this without it being like full of. These are difficult, anguishing conversations, and it's going to be until society is more equal, they're just going to continue to be that way. I mean, there's another essay in my book. It draws on Linda Nochlund's work called White Walls, Glass Ceiling, where I write about why women are underrepresented in art. Because there's a lot of conversation about that 10 years ago. There's a lot more conversation about it now. And I guess the reason, my impetus for writing that was that I feel like a lot of times these questions about representation are waged at the level of voluntarism, and it's just like, we just need to think hard about this. The problem is just that we haven't talked about it enough. And that's, I think, half true, I think that it's half because there are, if you just pay more attention to who you write about, if you pay more attention to the privileges and biases that you bring to the table, that helps. If you, check yourself in various kinds of ways, that is important. But I feel like the conversation is so heavily weighted towards just like the answer to everything. So we just need to think harder about this. And on the other hand, there are actual material barriers. There are inequalities in society that need to be addressed. And if you don't have a conversation about how you, what kind of ways you can address those things, then you kind of are having half of the conversation. And I don't think the questions of judgment get worked out until there. And the last thing I'll say is I don't necessarily always think the questions of judgment are the most important ones. I think that they're important questions. I don't think you can reduce these kind of movies. Always want to reduce the quality of art to the ethical position of the artist, usually by overlooking more the difficult things about the artist's biography. You can't always do that. But I just don't think, it's not always the case that just whether something is just good in some abstract way is the most important thing. There are all kinds of other issues that come into play, including, what kind of stories you want to tell, who you want to talk to, that are completely valid. Those aren't peripheral issues or secondary to the quality, quote unquote, in the abstract. So lots of different questions. These are the questions at the moment. This is the big big questions. I can extemporize on them, but I can't give you a fully satisfactory answer.
Okay, that's probably a good note to end on, an unsatisfactory answer. Thank you very much, Ben.